normal public road, but really exploring autonomous vehicle control right up to the limits of what these cars are capable of doing.
We're using X1, which is a completely student-built vehicle test bed platform.
So you guys get the idea. Not only one recommendation I would give you when using videos is definitely preview them beforehand and to make sure that the content is appropriate for students. Also, if you go with reputable web sources such as here Stanford University, or for example history.com or nationalgeographic.com, these might be great sources to really get some valid information for your students. There are other ways also to use non-linguistic representations to help our students. Here's 5 different strategies that you might incorporate in your classroom. My personal favorite is definitely creating graphic organizers that students can use to represent knowledge. Other forms might be to make physical models or manipulatives, to generate mental pictures or ask students to create mental pictures, create pictures, illustrations, and pictographs, and even engaging students in kinesthetic activities where they move around the classroom. This is great for students who learn better through kinesthetic modalities. Let's continue. Over here we see graphic organizers. I think this is probably, again, one of my favorite strategies and one that I use very often in my classroom in collaboration with other strategies as well. Some examples of graphic organizers that I might use could include plot maps, for example, like this one. Here we have a main idea map, and there's a few others listed like cause and effect, T-charts, cluster webs. There's a lot of them. In fact, just to show you just a few that are used in my classroom, besides the advanced organizer, we have evidence building when you're creating or you're working on 2 sides of an argument. Freyer models when you are reviewing vocabulary. There you go. Okay. What else do we got? We got cluster maps when students are grouping or classifying ideas into different categories and bubbles. Here's another activity which is great for having students consider 2 sides of an argumentative issue. This is a great one for when you want students to paraphrase the main idea from different paragraphs. What about one possibly that is great for character development and how a character develops throughout a story? Sometimes they like coloring these as well. For example, like a story map, like the one that I had shown before. Those are just some examples of the ones that I use within my language arts classroom. Graphic organizers, they really help students understand how information should be organized or how they can, organize that information in their brains as well. Sometimes you have to really show a student how to use a graphic organizer before you can simply set them free to use it. So you may want to really coach them through that process or model that the first few times. Once they get to know it, it's a great idea to actually have students create their own graphic organizers. This can really be a powerful way to teach strategies like text structures, so that they're really looking for cause and effect or problem solution structures within a text as they read it. This really helps them when they get to FSA writing later and they really need to be able to analyze text and then find the text structures in it in order to write their own response to that writing. Using manipulatives is something that I don't do as much, although there are some ways to use it in language arts. It seems possibly to be a strategy that might lend itself more towards math or science, but there are ways to use it in language arts. One such example of that would be using a word sort activity in which you create cutouts of different words and you ask students to classify them or to put them in certain groups according to certain criteria. This does also fall into the comparing and classifying strategies that we will talk about in a little while as well. Another strategy here is generating mental pictures. I like to really have students create mental pictures in their mind and then write or describe to me, using all of the senses when they write and they describe. And this really encourages students to think, maybe to pull up old memories or experiences. Again, it brings up prior knowledge often, and it is a powerful way to really get students to, begin conceptualizing the knowledge in their own minds. Let's continue. Okay. All right. Anyway, Creating pictures, illustrations, and pictographs is another idea. I will often ask students perhaps to draw illustrations for a picture or story so we get a visual representation instead of always asking them to write. It's another creative way to get them to represent their knowledge. Sometimes you might ask them, another interesting example is to do visual mnemonics to really show that they understand the meaning of vocabulary words and come up with visual ways to represent that info. I'm going to continue. My mouse seems to have decided to stop working, so I apologize. Yep, okay. Alright, anyway. Sorry, guys. There you go. Okay, sorry. Anyway, another idea would be to have students be able to move around the classroom during lessons and use kinesthetic strategies. Sometimes some teachers may feel that this is probably can be a chaotic strategy to use, but I recommend it at least every once in a while to kind of mix things up in the classroom. And it's kind of a fun way to get students again to move around through acting or pantomiming. They can show that they understand the meaning of words or vocabulary words, for example. Or one example that I have is that I'll give kids, for example, vocabulary words, and I'll ask them to stand in line according to the degree of the connotation of the word. So, for example, spooky might be at the low level of what being scared is, right? Scary might be a little higher. Terrifying might be higher than that. Bone chilling above that. Ghastly. So, in other words, students might stand in line and then be able to explain, why did you guys choose to, set yourselves up like that? And each student could describe possibly their thinking, or maybe how they debated with the other students on which word might be, how they decided the order together. Let's continue. Summarizing is another powerful strategy, and one that we use often in language arts. But it's important also to show kids how to summarize. And some of those methods that you might use to get better summarizing, I would follow the rule-based summarizing strategy that was included in our text. One of those includes, here's the steps. You take out material that's not important to understanding. We just want the most important. Take out words that might repeat the same information. Replace a list of things with just one word that simplifies it. Instead of trying to write every, one in a series out, just write the simple category that it's in. Find a topic sentence. This is also great for helping students focus on creating their own topic sentences or main ideas. Note-taking is also a very powerful strategy, but the problem with note-taking is that sometimes teachers assume that students already know how to do it, and teachers really should, give explicit directions in how they want their students to be able to take notes. Sometimes students definitely, need that, and they really benefit from it. So give students, teacher-prepared notes, maybe show them the way that you do it, or model the note-taking for them at first. You might teach them a variety of note-taking formats. Sometimes a school will have a particular strategy that they use across different classrooms. For example, Cornell Notes may be a strategy that is used in several different schools and utilized by many teachers. I've seen it used often at different schools. And so it's been an easy one for me to fall back on because kids are already familiar with it. But, also one more thing about note-taking. You want your students to use their notes, review their notes, and study with their notes. So maybe give them time to revise their notes and really learn how to utilize those notes. Maybe quiz each other, look over each other's notes, help each other take good notes. That might be a way to get them to really look at them and review. Homework is potentially a controversial topic when it comes to education. There have been, studies that show mixed results on whether or not it helps student achievement as much as other strategies do. But many teachers still do give homework, and some things that I would say about homework would be that you want to give an appropriate amount of homework for the age level of your students. You don't just want to give homework just to keep students busy. The homework should be based on standards and practice and things that students need to review and go over in order to master them better. Also, another thing that you can do with homework, or actually, I'll give you some strategies on the next slide of how to make homework a little more effective. by the way, they say that homework is more effective with middle and high school students than with elementary students. And that may have to do with the fact that a lot of the time, parents of younger students maybe help them along with a lot of their homework, and maybe the students aren't, being as responsible or independent for their own work. Here you go. Go ahead and tell them that they'll never believe I ate your homework. So, we all get that excuse sometimes. How can you make homework more effective? Again, design homework that supports academic learning goals in the classroom. The purpose should be to practice skills and processes in order to increase your speed, your accuracy, your fluency. I see that being very relevant to, mathematics, where students need to do multiple problems in order to get it done. But also, for example, in my classroom, I give students activities, with parts of speech and things like that, looking at sentences and writing sentences of different types of structures, so that they are more familiar with that by the time they get to the FSA test. They know compound sentences, complex compound sentences by the time they get there, and the difference between them. So providing feedback to students is gonna, provide more of more gains and more, achievement from your students than simply just collecting and giving grades for it. So written comments are probably the best way to provide feedback, but you should certainly be giving students some kind of feedback. If you're assigning homework, make sure you're giving them some feedback on how that homework's helping them or how they're doing. A very powerful strategy that Marzano has really highlighted over the years is how identifying similarities and differences can really help our students. That's definitely been one of the high yield strategies that he's spoken about in a lot of his research. Studies show this strategy can produce an effect size of up to 25 percentile points in our students, so it's definitely worth the time to use it. The 4 different ways of using similarities and differences might include comparing, classifying, creating metaphors, and analogies. Let's compare strategies here. Okay, here we have comparing, right? It's the process of identifying similarities or differences between things and ideas. Here's some steps to how to do it. You select items, you identify the characteristics to compare, and then you explain how items are similar. The same goes with classifying over here. There's a process to classifying. By the way, of course, one of the most classic strategies for comparing or contrasting would be the use of a Venn diagram. Some people enjoy the T-chart, which is a little more organized for some students who don't like the messiness of a circle. I often give my students the option of which one they like to use. Classifying, is like we were saying with word sorts, that kind of falls in that same category, where students figure out ways and categories in which to put certain words or ideas or something that they're thinking about, some topic that they're studying. Here's a classifying list as well. This one might be used for science class. It has to do with living and non-living things, for example. Maybe a graphic organizer like this might help students at first, and sometimes teachers may want to provide students with the categories at first so that they're not lost or confused on how do I start this. One of the most effective strategies is always to model what you want your students to do and show them what good examples of it look like before you set them free to simply own the strategies themselves. So I highly recommend that with any strategy that I've recommended today. Try to show your students the first time, really guide them, and then later they can probably begin doing these things on their own, or they can do it more independently. 2 other ways of comparing and contrasting, finding similarities and differences would be creating metaphors or creating analogies. 2 interesting examples I can give you, for example, metaphors in ELA might be looking at a poem like "O Captain, My Captain," in which really the poem and the captain represents someone like Abraham Lincoln in history, and the voyage, which is closed and done in the poem, is an example of, or they're describing sort of the end of the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation. There's an example of how students can see a big overarching metaphor in a poem and understand how that can work. Another example of creating analogies might be to compare some things that you studied in class in order for students to find maybe some similarities between them in some way. An example that I thought of recently from some of the work I was doing was like an analogy like this. Like Gandhi was to India's emancipation as Martin Luther King was to Well, here probably you'd want students to come up with the signing of the Civil Rights Act, right? The final sort of goal that both were like working towards. But you may have to help students with analogies because it can be kind of tricky to come up with your analogies on their own. Generating and testing hypothesis. Now this is getting to what we were saying at the beginning.